Welcome to DOC NYC's Spring Showcase. I'm Thom Powers, the festival's artistic director. I'm pleased to host this conversation on Louis Theroux, Life on the Edge from BBC Select. Louis, thank you for being here.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to do this, Tom. I'm always happy to spread the word about my programs, and especially in the beautiful city of New York.
So this series, Life on the Edge, you're reviewing your career. You kind of begin with Louis Theroux's Weird Weekends. But before that, you got your start on TV working as a correspondent for Michael Moore's TV Nation. And I'm interested to hear what you learned on that job and what you took away from that experience.
Absolutely. And just to start by dispelling a common misconception, although I come across very British, I'm in fact half American. My dad is American, and I came up in journalism in New York. I was working at Spy magazine, and I got hired by Michael Moore kind of in an unexpected way. Like I had aspirations to work in television, but not to be a TV journalist. And some friends who were working with Michael, who'd worked at Spy, brought me along, and I was interviewed by Michael, not really realizing that he might be considering me as a correspondent. And in fact, he put me on TV with no experience, with no real qualifications, and no natural aptitude, I would argue. Certainly no wardrobe. I didn't have the haircut of a network correspondent. So with kind of an outlandish piece of good fortune, I was sent on my way. And the first segment I ever made for Michael and for TV Nation was called Millennium. It was about groups that think the end of the world is about to happen, religious groups around America. Some of them, one was a UFO cult, one was a sort of neo-Nazi outfit, one was a fundamentalist Christian guy. And that sort of set the template for work that I did, not just at TV Nation, but almost like for 25 years. Like I spent kind of on the beat of American, sort of strange American cultural phenomena, often with an ethical, some sort of knotty or dubious ethical dimension. Your question was really, what did I learn from Michael, was it?
Yeah.
And in point of fact, other than kind of giving me my job, he also set me on the path of a certain style of filmmaking. Like I didn't really realize at the time how different his way of working was. I was coming out of print journalism, and so I had no experience of TV. And in fact, so when I saw what he did, I just thought that was normal. What his practice was to use verite documentary techniques. Like in TV, it's fairly normal to light things and to sort of have a sense of, well, we'll show up and we'll film a bit and then we'll stop. Michael's attitude was, we are guerrilla journalists who are out to take on the world. And if we get arrested while doing it, then consider that a feather in your cap. Like he used to say, like, this isn't a TV show, like this is a revolution. He had a year zero attitude. And that appealed to a kind of slightly callow, but kind of, I was a young person who was out with a sort of a slight angry edge, like a lot of young people. Like I thought I wanted to take on a world that seemed to not be kind of paying me enough attention in some way. And so all of that Jacobin world-changing attitude was very appealing. But concretely, it was everything was handheld. Whenever you arrived somewhere, it was a case of, you don't ask for permission to film, you just turn up while filming. When you meet someone for this, you knock on the door and you're filming. So anything, just be open to the unexpected. And often it was as simple as find people who you think might be up to no good, and then just keep filming and filming until the truth somehow tumbles out of them. You get the goods on them. The second segment I ever made was about the Ku Klux Klan. And it was very much the case of like, I would just send Louis in and basically let him at them, and let's uncover the truth about these people who, have poisonous beliefs and strip away the veneer of public relations to get to the heart of what they do. Later on, I worked at longer form when I came to make Weird Weekends. And I think I took on a less adversarial attitude because there are limitations built into that adversarial approach. And it can be a way of working that's so kind of caustic and, as I say, sort of, it embodies an us against them. It can lack a certain humanistic or generous attitude if you're not careful. And later on, I tried to take on subjects where there was a mixture of tones and good people alongside not so good people. But in those early days, it was a case of just go in there and more or less get the goods. Yeah, it was a fairly almost military style outfit, a
Well,
revolutionary one, I should say.
I was just reading your book, Gotta Get Through This, where you write about your days in television and give some kind of behind the scenes insights. And one of the things you talk about early in your career is qualms you had about setting people up for laughs. In your words, you didn't want to be a hatchet man. And I wonder how you adapted your style to to get around that concern.
Well, that's exactly, I guess, what I'm talking about. And in a way, journalism in general, documentary making for sure, embodies there's this inherent conflict that is present to differing degrees in all different kinds of projects, to do with the obligation to get the truth, and on the other hand, your obligation to behave in a way that is kind, and those things don't always run alongside one another. It would be nice if they did. Sometimes you go out there and you, in the course of trying to get to the truth, that whole notion of, which Janet Malcolm famously described in The Journalist and the Murderer, like a sort of seduce and betray attitude, or even just a sort of a vision in which you see the contributors as in some way the enemy or the person you're trying to do over. It's a very limiting and limited. There are times and places, I suppose, where that applies, right? And there are certain, you think of, it's not exactly in the documentary mold, but aspects of what someone like Sacha Baron Cohen does, when he's in character as Borat, or on occasion what Michael does when he's among people who he is trying to show as villains, as kind of as evildoers of different sorts. There is a sort of it takes a certain chilly detachment, and that doesn't sit. For me personally, like, that's valid as a way of working. It's one way of working, but for me, I actually I really do like to see the best in people. And what I've always found myself surprised by is that when going into the outer reaches of the human experience, going among people who might seem like tabloid villains, what I've tended to be surprised by is how likable they are. And as much as when I started out, it was about kind of going in there and getting the goods on them, later on, I tried, when it came time to do my own series, which was Weird Weekends, I tried to open myself up to the complete experience of people who I might have disagreed with or seen as other in some way, and I tried to acknowledge how those questionable qualities coexisted with human qualities. The classic example, although it's a very extreme one, is when I made an episode of Weird Weekends about neo-Nazis. Actually, the whole episode was about militiamen in Idaho and Montana, people who thought the world was ending and the government's going to take our guns away. And in fact, it's one that I revisit in Life on the Edge, this recent series that I did. I revisit one or two of the people that I met back then. It was in 1996. But along the way on the journey, I went to the headquarters of Aryan Nations, and there was a neo-Nazi there called Jerry Grudel, who at the top of a guard tower at their compound announced that he was a big fan of the British sitcom Are You Being Served, which led to a whole kind of weird, queasy encounter in which we both reminisced about Are You Being Served, and then he went off on an anti-Semitic rant. I mean, it was such a strange encounter, but it was sort of the crystallization of the whole idea that people are so multidimensional, and that the same person who is absolutely abhorrent in his outlook is actually trying to not just tell you about his enjoyment of Are You Being Served, but trying to bond, because that's what it was. It was an attempt to reach out and bond with me in some way over our shared affection for this series. So that sort of became the template for what I sought to do, which was see people in three dimensions, go into the most extreme places and find some kind of common ground.
Well, it's interesting when we watch Life on the Edge, we see a lot of extremists who you're portraying with deep-seated racism. And I think in the early 2000s or late 90s, if you were viewing one of those segments, um, you might have thought, oh, well, those are fringe characters. But by 2016, with the election of Donald Trump, that kind of politics really moved more to the center of of American politics. And I wonder if that was something that you saw coming because of all this reportage you had done, or if it was just as surprising to you as it was to many of us.
I wish I could say that I'd seen it coming. I will say that I wasn't blithely predicting that Hillary Clinton would win the election. When people asked at the time, what's going to happen? I said, there's a chance Trump will win. Because I've always believed that people are, I mean, I can put it crudely, like we are more mixed up and twisted, right, than we commonly acknowledge. And we go through life putting this front on, we put on our bow ties, if I may acknowledge the bow tie in the room. We put on our suit jackets and our glasses, we brush our teeth, and we face the world like normal people, but deep underneath, we know that we're more poisonous and hateful, and we're full of rage and complicated. We have thoughts that if people could see through into our minds would be deeply embarrassing. And that's, that part of that is socialization, but part of it is a kind of false front, a veneer of civilization. So in a way, when Trump was elected, I was surprised, but I wasn't shocked. And I think going back, what we saw, and whole books have been written about this, what we saw was that the internet, in addition to bringing people together, it also kind of brought weird people together, right? People who were on the fringe, and that forms of belief and forms of behavior that maybe would have been more niche sort of reached a critical mass, and that the human psyche in all its complexity was laid bare. And I sort of see Trump as a byproduct of all of that. And it's worth mentioning that, one of the pleasures of making Life on the Edge was seeing how aspects of life that, as you say, had been fringe. And I say it's a pleasure because it makes me feel like I was in some way prophetic. It's not in the global historical sense. It's rather sad that there's more division and more hate on display. But I think it's interesting that the people who I met on the hilltop in Idaho in 1996, one man in particular, a guy called Mike Cain, who was predicting apocalypse, right? Who was predicting that the world would more or less end and that he'd probably go down in a hail of bullets shot down by the federal authorities. Like, that was the vision that he laid bare. Well, I caught up with him 25 years later for Life on the Edge. He was living in Texas, and quite evidently the world had not ended. But the more surprising part was that he was a big Trump supporter, like the man who'd had nothing good to say about the federal government, who was expecting a fiery Armageddon and a sort of war of all against all, was actually saw reasons for hope in the election of Donald Trump, and that ideas and vision and a kind of vision of America that had previously, you really needed to go to the wild and wooliest parts of the country to hear about, or deep into the internet, was now sort of being broadcast from Twitter accounts close to the president. And we sort of saw that on Jan 6th too, didn't we? Like in the Capitol insurrection, it felt to me very much an expression of something that had been gestating for 25 years as well, expressing ideas that I'm imagining Mike Cain, the militiaman, would have been very much in favor of.
Mm-hmm. So in Life on the Edge, you have these juxtapositions between people that you interviewed maybe 20 years ago or more, and then you're catching up with them today. There's a couple girls, sisters that you interviewed when they were young and they were singing pro-Nazi songs. Mm-hmm. And today in adulthood, they've renounced those ideas. There's a porn actor who's now an IT consultant. And I wonder, as you look back on this footage, if you saw changes in yourself.
Very much so. And by the way, not just physical ones. Obviously, like I was a young man. I was hired by Michael Moore when I was 23 years old. I barely had enough stubble to grow a beard with, right? I was literally a kind of, puberty was still in my rear view mirror. You know what I mean? I was a man child with like very little knowledge about the world, very little self-knowledge. I'm not trying to say now I'm kind of Gandalf, although I can grow a beard. I think that I'm a grown man with 3 sons of my own. I think that I try, I no longer feel I have something to prove in quite the same way, which I think has made me in certain respects, I'd like to think kinder, more empathetic. I'm not trying to establish a reputation. I'm less insecure about my own talent, such as it is. Like, in other words, I used to think that in order to justify my salary, somehow that involved embarrassing myself or kind of pushing things in a way that was potentially uncomfortable. I mean, I'm still up for getting out of my comfort zone, but I really feel I have nothing to hide. And I think it's a healthy attitude when you feel that you can go into the world that you're investigating. I used to sort of see it as not a hit and run, but an undercover operation. I worried about people finding out. Well, the show was called Weird Weekends, right? So it was quite evidently, there was a slight attitude built into it of, oh, I'm going among the weird people. Like, and I know it was never quite that simple. Like, I'm still proud of those shows, but I'm in plain sight. Like, anyone can Google me, and I encourage people that I'm making programs about to Google me, so they can find out how many BAFTAs I've won. It's important they should know who they're meeting. No, but because I sort of think that I'm an open book, and I'm not trying to hide from my track record. And oh God, I'm doing a long answer to your question. I just see the world as, the world's complicated, and I'd like to think I've got some emotional maturity now. But as I say that, I'm aware of my wife thinking what she would think if she heard me say that. She'd say, "You definitely don't."
Well, it's interesting how many of these people that you interviewed 20 years ago or more, who audiences may have watched and thought that person's a real extremist, maybe was the subject of laughter or scorn for audiences, but you've maintained some kind of connection to them that they're willing to come back and still talk to you.
Well, I think that the extent to which I was sending up the people that I would interview, certainly by the time I got to Weird Weekends, has been exaggerated. And I think partly that's to do with the sort of the perception of a culture clash. I've always maintained that I have more in common with the people that I speak to than it might first appear. I think partly that's to do with having an American father, right? Who, by the way, he won't mind me putting his business out there. He's a gun owner, right? He's not a kind of NRA member, but he grew up. He was an Eagle Scout. I should mention, he's a writer and travel writer, but he's very much a kind of patriotic American. And when I was growing up, he brought us. We used to spend our summer vacation in America, and I see, like, under the skin, I have some American, if I can put it this way. Like, I do tend to see that I have some American values, or some sort of sense of can do, some sort of sense of taking people as you find them. And so when I'm with, the people that I make programs about, it's not just a put on. Like, the programs tend to work best when there's some rapport there. Now, it's not always the case. Like, there's been people I've made programs about who've been upset by them, right? And who've said, like, you turned me over, how dare you? But more often, I've tended to think that the people have been happy with how the shows turned out, and that's shown in the fact that I've gone back and re-interviewed people, and as you say, kept in touch. I made how many episodes? Like, maybe about 20 episodes of Weird Weekends, and then I've made 30 or so other specials afterwards, hour-long documentaries, and more often than not, I think people feel I've done an okay job. I'd like to think so.
Well, you refer to your father, Paul Theroux, who some viewers would know as a best-selling novelist. His book Mosquito Coast is now been adapted into a new series, as well as a previous film. And you write in your book about an early feeling of, in your career, of wanting to make a mark in the world the way he made a mark in the world. And I wonder, yeah, I mean, that's a powerful thing that many of us live with, is seeing ourselves in the eyes of our fathers. And I wonder, how you feel now at the age of 50, looking back on this career, how you look at your own career.
Well, I hope it doesn't sound big-headed if I say I'm proud of having done, of having made the documentaries that I have done. Like I recognize they're very much group endeavors. Like I think it's one thing I talk about in my book quite a lot: the weirdness of being a host or a presenter, as it's called in the UK, of documentaries or of a TV show, where you sort of get all the credit, whereas in fact, obviously, I work with directors and editors and producers. That being said, I feel as though this is my dad is not just a highly accomplished, very literary writer, travel writer, world traveler, who's got more than 50 books to his name. I mean, he's an extraordinary person, but he's also he's a big personality, and someone who in many respects shaped and guided me through my childhood, either actively or sort of almost passively, just by the gravitational pull of his personality and sort of his accomplishments. So I in different ways I've adapted, in ways that I probably haven't fully examined. I've adapted around that. And I think what strikes me is I always thought I should be a writer. I always imagined that's what you're supposed to be. And I sort of defaulted into television because partly I was worried about being compared to him, and partly I just thought I wasn't as good at writing as I should be. Certainly not as good as he is by a long chalk. And then, it's been 25 years coming, but I sort of look back now and think that's fine to be in television, right? It sounds odd, but I to me, it always somehow seemed, and I feel odd even saying this, but second best, right? But I think, and now I'm in a place where I think maybe it isn't second best. Maybe it is what it is. It's a separate sphere of achievement where my talents evidently lean more towards. And I'm happy to say he is my number one fan, if I can put it that way, in the sense of he watches my programs. Whenever there's a new one out, he will, he lives in Hawaii, so he'll ask for a link. I send him a link, he'll watch it, he'll give me thoughtful notes. He's also a TV watcher, I should say. He's not he's high-minded and literary, right? You'll catch him reading Henry James or Faulkner or whoever you care to name. We were definitely brought up in a literary household, but he also loves David Letterman, and he loves nothing better than catching whatever documentaries on Netflix, he's into. And so, and he really enjoys my programs. So that means a lot to me.
I'm interested in your technique of meeting someone for a relatively short amount of time. There are some documentary filmmakers who will follow a subject, or as you refer to them in the UK, contributor. It's an interesting difference in words between the two countries' fields. But some people will follow someone for months to get into their life.
Yeah, or years even.
Yeah, you're more going in for a few days. And I wonder, what you've learned in your techniques of being able to make the most of that time to capture someone's personality.
That's a great question, and I think it points up where I sit uneasily in some respects in the classical documentary space. I'm not a director. I'm really whether you call it an interviewer or journalist or on-screen host or whatever it is. And there's a kind of interesting division of labor, whereas the director and producer will arrive usually sometimes weeks or months before and do what's called a recce. Like they get to know prospective contributors or subjects, and then they'll come back and we'll kind of plot a journey, right, in whatever world. And then in going back, then we film. That's when we first film. We go back. So it's my first visit, but the director and producer will typically have met, excuse me, will typically have met the subjects before. So it means that, a lot of time, we sort of have a pretty good idea of who I'm going to meet and the fact that they'll be helpful, that they'll be revealing that something interesting about them. But because I'm on screen, like I'm not behind the camera, in the way that Nick Broomfield does sound, so he's slightly different, but he's there with a kind of function, or whoever, Herzog sometimes wanders into vision, sometimes doesn't. Michael does, but they're both directors. My only job is to sort of participate and to peel away the layers with kind of judicious questions. And I think that it's a real strength of our approach that I don't have to be precious or fussy about letting it organically happen. Like I tend to think, that look, there's no such, there's more than one way to skin a cat, as they say. But I think that for me, I can arrive, I could just, I can do a lot of exposition through like, where am I? Who are you? What are we doing? What's happening? Why are you wearing a bow tie? Like it all can get laid out quite quickly. And then having on day 2 or day 3, or sometimes we'll fly back in a few weeks, we'll go by and we'll fly out again. I can drill in and regroup, and I can create scenes out of just by being a sort of, not just a interrogator, but also a protagonist. You can create actuality and you can create scenes. I'm sort of on my hobby horse now, so forgive me, but I sort of think like sometimes when directors sit back and like, let's just let it all unfold. I sort of think, well, why? Why not just get in there and actually shake it up a bit, like make something happen? I did a film about Scientology where in the course of making it, they began filming me, right? Because that's classically what they do. They document and sometimes harass journalists who are interested in them, which you can see as a sort of a scary or intimidating thing, or you can see it as a kind of a brilliant piece of access, right? Because, wow, we don't even have to make an appointment. They're just going to show up with their cameras and film you. And it's just an example of how I can then, if there weren't someone on camera, like you'd be a bit lost, like, what do you do with that? But I can then engage with them. Anything that happens, I'm a light. The metaphor, is it a metaphor? Is it just a symbol? Like the analogy I use is, I'm a lightning rod, and I'm out there, and you sort of can draw the lightning, and that's what you want. Like, it's so much of what to me, what's exciting about documentaries is when there's a sense of danger, right? When there's a sense of, wow, I really don't know where this is going to go, or he's gone out into this world and he's getting his comeuppance in some way. The contributors, the people he's among, the subjects, have seen him coming and are giving him a hard time. And it doesn't, and those are the moments where you think that the audience at home is going to sit forward on its chair and think, how is Louis going to get out of this one, right? What's going to happen now, And to me, that's really it's one of my most important jobs. Also, being a sympathetic presence is important, being a good listener, trying to see what's going on in a given setting. But sometimes it's just a case of being in a situation and catalyzing some kind of encounter, some conflict or drama.
Well, I really appreciate you taking time today to talk through these things. And for any viewers who are intrigued by Louis' show, I highly recommend his book, Gotta Get Through This, as another layer of telling some of these behind the scenes stories. Thanks very much, Louis.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for your great questions. I feel like I could have talked for the next 2 hours, so it's lucky that you were able to rein me in. And thank you for plugging my book. I think it's only available as an audio book in the US. I say only, I mean, that's a format that more and more people enjoy. So and Life on the Edge is a 4-part series that I think is going to be on BBC Select, and as discussed, is a look back at my career. But thank you for letting me be on as part of this conversation.
It's great to have you.